Amid the roaring spring flood of the Black Elk River, folks saw May Caldwell, a widow cursed for having buried 3 men, kneeling on the slick stone bank, her trembling hands cradling the face of an unconscious Apache warrior. Rain sluiced through her hair, blood mingled with the icy current, and then her lips found his, breathing the last breath back into his chest. But in this land, a kiss that saves a life is not just a debt of gratitude. With his people, it is a sacred marriage vow, a binding cord that ties 2 fates together. From the banks of the Black Elk to the dust-choked Main Street, the destiny of a woman and a warrior is about to be decided between the laws of the old ways and the grudges of the new. Stay and hear this story through, because there are vows never spoken aloud, yet they hold for a lifetime. Dry Willow, spring of 1888. May Caldwell was no stranger to the peculiar hush her footsteps seemed to stir. In Dry Willow, the small town tucked along the edge of the Black Elk Range, folks either knew you or knew of you, long enough that there was no need for asking. Stories here could live through more winters than a man had fingers, lying quiet as embers beneath ash until given the slightest chance to flare, giving off a heat no one welcomed. For May, those stories always bore the same name, Black Mountain Widow. 3 men, 3 times they had stepped across her porch alongside her, and never once returned. The first lay buried under rock after a mine collapse on a December morning. The second burned with fever during the epidemic that near brought the whole town to its knees. The third took a bullet while guiding a freight team through border country thick with road agents. No one much cared for the details or for the cruel hand of coincidence. Out here, 3 deaths was enough to turn a woman into an omen. So when she walked down the main street, the noon sun laid thin across the awnings. Folks saw her, but rarely met her gaze. Women under porch shade, leaning against posts with baskets or aprons in hand, would draw their children in close as if that arm's length was a kind of shield. Men still tipped their hats, still spoke the words, but the greeting was light as dust over water, vanishing without a ripple. Their eyes would drop to the ground, to a loose stone or a boot print, rather than risk meeting hers head-on. Dry Willow that day looked no different than most. Sunlight bleached every warped grain in the porch boards, winked off patched tin like a restless coin. At the corner, Mrs. Greeley's dress shop door groaned in the wind. A few paces on, Dorsey's saddle shop spilled the mingled smell of fresh-cut hide and pine pitch, the kind that clung stubborn to the air. A yellow dog lay curled by a water barrel, tail twitching whenever the flies got too bold. But higher up, toward the mountains, something was shifting. Clouds were gathering, dark and heavy, like thick cloth being drawn to a single point. May noticed as she stepped from the general store, the wicker basket on her arm, heavier with flour, lard, and salt. The light along the rooftops had changed, less sharp now, softened, as though the sky had pulled a gauzy gray veil across itself. She slowed her pace, old leather boots thudding lightly over the hard-packed street. Dust, hide, and the dry edge of mountain wind mingled in the air. No one, least of all May, could have guessed that in just a few hours that sky would rip open, spilling a hard rain, and she would be kneeling at the riverbank, hair plastered to her face, arms locked around the chest of a stranger, forcing breath into him as if tending the last spark in a dying fire. Being watched was nothing new. Sideways glances, muffled talk, greetings cut short when she turned. These had become the low hum of her life. But in rare moments, when wind poured down from the valley carrying the damp scent of soil and the rustle of leaves against each other, She could still feel something wider, older than those narrow stairs. It lay somewhere beyond this town, in a place where no one called her by that worn-out name. That noon, as May set the basket down on her porch step, a far-off rumble rolled in, faint, but enough to raise the skin on her arms. The wind shifted, spilling down from the Black Elk peaks with the cold breath of lingering snow. She stood at the window, fingers brushing over the smooth groove worn by 100 touches, eyes on the land outside. From there, she could see the Black Elk River winding at the mountain's foot, usually a tame thing, now swollen, its surface mottled with the shadows of cloud. A dark shape moved along the bank, a horse, and on its back an Apache rider sitting straight, his deerskin-lined jacket standing out against stone and water. It happened so fast there was no time to think. A white spear of lightning struck not far off, its crack shaking her window frame. The horse reared, wheeled sideways. The rider flew from the saddle, hit the rock, and rolled straight into the churning water. May saw him vanish under a surge of white, then surface again, limp, head striking a boulder. She didn't wait. The door banged open under her hand, hinges shrieking in the wind. She crossed the yard, vaulted the low fence, boots sliding in the fresh mud. Rain had started, cold, heavy drops slapping her cheeks and shoulders like a hand urging her on. In moments, she was at the river's edge, eyes locked on the dark figure being carried downstream. The bank was slick, but May's feet knew this ground from girlhood. She plunged in. The current seized her, ice cold, making her gasp. Hair streamed across her face, clinging to her neck. The water's pull was a great rope cinched around her waist, dragging her back with every step. But she saw him, only a few yards away, face down, arms trailing. Her hand shot out, fingers fisting in the water-darkened hide of his jacket. The current wrenched at her shoulder, but she didn't let go. Each wave broke over her head. She surfaced, gulped air, kicked hard into the shifting bottom to keep him afloat. Every yard gained was like climbing a hill in deep sand. But at last the shore rose beneath her boots. They collapsed onto the wet sand. May dropped to her knees beside him, water streaming from her chin to his chest. His face was ashen, lips gone blue. She pressed her hand to his sternum, felt nothing but a heavy stillness. Without pause, she tipped his head back, pinched his nose, and sealed her mouth over his, pushing the last warmth in her chest into his. Once. Then again. Water spilled from the corner of his mouth, mixing with the rain beating down. Her palms pressed hard against his chest, finding the rhythm her mother and grandmother had passed down, women who knew how to haul a life back from the brink. Her breath carried the scent of wet earth, copper-sharp blood, and the cold of the rain itself. In that moment, she was not the widow whispered about in town, not the shadow men avoided meeting. She was only a woman trying to hold on to a single breath against the hand of the river. That afternoon, the sky was a spreading ink stain bleeding across the gray parchment of the horizon. Along the edge of the world, clouds gathered, dense as burning coal heaped into a forge, each layer stacking heavy on the next. The wind had shifted, spilling down from the Black Elk peaks, colder now, carrying the damp scent of honeysuckle. In that stillness, there was something like the low, steady beat of a distant drum, telling anyone who cared to listen that the storm had already begun its long walk toward the valley. Thunder came fast, not in a single growl, but in a series of rips across the mountain's flank, echoing down through stone gullies. The sound rolled into the small cabin on the hillside where May Caldwell stood at her window. From here, she could see the Black Elk River winding like a silver ribbon at the mountain's base, gentle most days, but now thick with the color of earth, swelling with the force of spring. Through the darkening water, a horse's silhouette emerged, framed by the first scattered drops of rain. May knew at once he wasn't one of Dry Willow's riders. The straight-backed seat, the deerskin-lined coat, and the black and red patterns on the saddle marked him as Apache. She watched his horse pick its way carefully along the bank, until a white spear of lightning tore the sky and struck somewhere near the riverside trail. The crash of it rattled her window frame. The horse reared, forelegs slashing the air, eyes wide with panic. The rider was pitched from the saddle, his body twisting mid-air before slamming into the rocky bank. May saw him roll once more, then vanish into the churning current. His head clipped a boulder, snapping to one side with a sharp, terrible finality. The image seared into her mind in an instant, too vivid to fade. May didn't think, she moved. Her hand threw the latch. The door swung open with a hinge cry into the wind. A cold, wet gust hit her full on, carrying the scent of rain not yet fallen and river mud already stirred. She crossed the small yard, her coat snagging on a chair leg at the porch, but she didn't stop to free it. The back door stood wide behind her, letting the wind scatter loose papers across the table. By the time she'd run a dozen paces, the rain broke. Not in thin, meandering drops, but in heavy, stone-weighted blows, the kind that fell like a hand slapping down again and again. They struck her hair, slid across her cheeks, bled into her collar until the cold reached bone. May kept on, boots skidding slightly down the slope toward the river. The Black Elk was no silver ribbon now. It had swollen wide, dark and flecked with white foam at its bends. The sound of water against rock, the rain, the thunder, the wind, everything merged into one thick, rolling roar. Through it all, she picked out the dark form being carried away, turned on its side, an arm moving weakly in the current, like a piece of drift lost to the flow. She hit the bank, catching herself, on a root jutting from the mud. One breath, then she plunged. The cold struck so deep her lungs seized, as if something inside had clenched its fist around her heart. The river wrapped her in a slick, muscular grip, pressing in, dragging at every stroke. Through the brown haze she saw nothing but flashes of white foam and stone. Above the surface, the Apache was drifting farther away. May kicked hard, each drive of her legs born of years wading the town's small creek. Yet nothing had prepared her for this force. Every yard closed was another burn in her lungs, another surge of numbness through her arms. Her fingers brushed the hem of his darkened coat. The leather slid under her grip, but she caught hold, knuckles locking like a hook. The current fought back at once, spinning them sideways. Her shoulders screamed, but she didn't let go. Stroke by stroke, breath by ragged breath between waves, she brought him closer to shore. Her boots finally found solid ground beneath the swirling brown water. May poured the last of her strength into hauling him on to the wet sand. He lay on his back, eyes closed, rain streaming from his hair down his neck. His skin was ashen, his lips darker than any bruise. May knelt, pressed her palm to his chest. Beneath the soaked, cold fabric, nothing. Instinct, or rather, the memory passed down through the women of her family, took over. She tipped his head back, braced his chin in one hand, pinched his nose and sealed her mouth over his. Her breath was hot, urgent, forcing its way into the frozen cage of his chest. Once, then again. Water spilled from the corner of his mouth, joining the rain that drummed against the sand. She laced her fingers, set them to his sternum, and pressed, hard, steady, willing his heart to take another beat. Each push was a silent bargain with whatever power still held him, each breath a plea sent into the still body beneath her hands. She worked in rhythm, long breaths, firm compressions, the smell of mud, blood, and rain wrapping around them. Somewhere in the distance, thunder cracked again, but May was listening for only one sound, the rough, broken cough of life returning. It came at last, a slight shudder, then a sharp, wet choke. He turned his head, spat out a mouthful of river, and dragged in a long, raw breath. May kept her hand on his shoulder until the rise and fall of his chest steadied, though his eyes remained closed. The rain hadn't eased. Heavy drops still hammered the sand, kicking up fresh spatters of mud. The river rolled on, unbothered, as if it had never held him at all. And May, breathing hard, hands trembling, knew that for this one moment, every whisper in Dry Willow had been drowned beneath the sound of the storm. When Talon Greyhawk opened his eyes, the first thing he registered wasn't light. It was scent. A mingling of wood smoke lingering in the air, and the warm, green breath of herbs, like summer air stolen into a winter day. He lay under the weight of a thick wool blanket, the yarn coarse to the touch, hand-knit in even, deliberate stitches. The warmth it gave wasn't only from the fire, but from the way someone had pulled it snug around his shoulders, sealing in every bit of heat. The room was small, its ceiling low and timbered, with light coming through a single window to his right. On the sill sat a small clay jar holding a few wild mint sprigs, their edges beginning to curl, their fragrance mixing with the resinous tang of pine smoke from the stove. In the corner, the embers in the hearth still glowed, breathing out a soft heat. Beside it, a low wooden table was scattered with small cloth pouches, glass jars, and a stone mortar and pestle worn with years of use. When he shifted, he felt the ache, deep, bone-heavy weariness, the kind that seemed to seep into his marrow. His right arm throbbed dully, and a sharp sting lit along his left temple when he tried to turn his head. Memory flickered. The thunder, the white flash, the horse's violent rear, the crush of cold water. Then darkness. A faint sound came from the table. May Caldwell sat there, her back bent slightly, both hands busy grinding a root the color of dry earth. She didn't glance over, yet he sensed she knew he was awake, perhaps from some small change in his breathing. On the table, the powdered root mingled with a dried leaf, its scent sharp and bitter, softened only when the stove's heat carried it upward. She rose, moving slowly toward him, a clay cup in hand. The gesture was steady but unhurried as she offered it. He took it, the ceramic warm against his cold fingers. The liquid was pale amber, bitter on the tongue, leaving behind the faintest sweetness, like honey gathered deep in the pines. There was no greeting, no quick questions, just a glance, brief and unreadable, before she returned to her work, the rhythm of the pestle steady and sure, keeping the room anchored in its stillness. Talon lay still, watching the small, practiced movements. She scraped the outer skin from another root with the back of a knife, letting the shavings fall neatly into a wooden bowl. When she'd finished, she swept them into her palm, dropped them into the mortar, and ground them, not with force but with enough weight to break them down without crushing them to dust. Outside the window, the sky still held the color of spent rain, dull gray like ash stirred into water. Wind pressed through the cracks in the walls, brushing against the boards, but inside the air was thick with warmth and the slow drift of medicine. He noticed the little things, the boots set neatly by the door, the long coat hanging from a peg, and beside it, a gray shawl still wet, dripping slowly onto the floor. A basket of dry pine boughs sat within easy reach of the stove, ready to keep the fire without braving the weather again. The silence held for a long while, but it wasn't heavy. It felt more like a narrow bridge strung across a space neither had named yet. As she worked, May glanced at him now and again, quick checks to see if the color had returned to his skin, or perhaps just to make sure his eyes were still open. Talon shifted, sitting up with care. The wool blanket slid from his shoulders, letting the cold brush against his skin. He pulled it back, not to hide himself, but to hold on to the warmth it offered. At the table, May poured a darker liquid from a small bottle into another cup. Its scent was stronger than the first, pungent, with a bite that reminded him of the medicines of his own people, yet threaded with something unfamiliar, a note he couldn't place. She set it on the low table beside the bed, a small nod serving as her invitation to drink, then turned away. He lifted the cup. The bitterness spread over his tongue, but heat bloomed in his chest with every swallow. When it was gone, he set it down, noticing the faint tremor in his calloused fingers. Whether from weakness or the fever's lingering grip, he couldn't tell. May didn't ask about the river. She didn't mention the storm. She only kept working, gathering the ground herbs into a square of coarse cloth, tying it into a small bundle, and setting it in a wooden jar. Her motions were the same as they must have been for years, steady, patient, precise. From outside came the occasional sound, a drop of water falling from the eaves into the mud, the scratch of a bare branch against the wall. Each time the light from the stove shifted faintly, glinting along the hairline cracks in the wooden planks. Weariness began to draw him toward that half-world between waking and sleep. Even there, he could hear the pestil's rhythm, smell the mingled herbs, and catch glimpses of May bending to pick up a stray pinch of leaves from the floor. The simple movements brought back memories of his mother, preparing remedies in the early arrival of winter. When he opened his eyes again, the light outside had dimmed. The fire burned higher, redder. May stood beside the stove, stirring a small pot with a wooden spoon, steam curling into the loose strands of hair around her face. She tilted her head, listening to the soft bubble of the broth, then ladled it into a bowl and set it on the table near his bed. The smell of wild greens and venison rose into the air, softening the sharper edge of the medicine. She placed a spoon inside the bowl, sliding it gently toward him. No urging, no insistence, just leaving it there, as if trusting he would eat when he chose. He lifted the spoon, tasting the hot broth. Its gentle sweetness and the game's wild depth spread through him, warmth reaching places the blanket could not. In the glow of the hearth, May's face held none of the wary curiosity or suspicion he knew so well from Dry Willow's stares. Instead, there was a quiet that carried more weight than any question. Talon realized it might be the first time in a long while that he'd been able to look at someone this way. Not as an enemy, not as an outsider, but simply as another person in the same room. The fire kept its steady burn. The wind still called through the cracks, and between them, the space no longer felt like distance, but like a path just opened, untrodden still, but already marked by the first set of footprints. In the days that followed, the small wooden house on the hillside became just enough space for two people long accustomed to solitude. Time here did not follow the church bells of Dry Willow, but the crackle of logs in the stove, the scent of herbs rising from a clay pot, and the slow drift of wind-cast shadows across the floorboards beneath the single window. Talon healed in increments. The pounding in his temple had eased, though his body still moved with the caution of someone earning back his strength. He spent long hours propped against the bed frame, watching May's movements the way one watches the changing shapes of a flame, not hurried, yet compelling enough to hold the eye. Their first exchanges were wordless. A cup of hot water set on the small table by his bed, her hand lingering just long enough on the rim to be sure it wasn't too hot. Or Talon, sitting on the porch, tilting his chin toward the lowering gray clouds, wordlessly warning that rain would come before dusk. May would step outside, gather a few more dry branches, and stack them by the door so no one would need to go out after dark. Gradually, small scraps of talk worked their way in, like warmth seeping from a coal hidden under ash. While cutting wild mint leaves, May remarked that their scent was sharper after the spring rains, and she preferred to gather them in the early morning while the dew still clung. Talon listened, nodding once, then told her how his people read the wind's direction by the movement of low grass on the hillside, a lesson his father had given him when he was just tall enough to stand beside a saddle. Some evenings, as darkness swallowed the light outside the window, the call of an owl would drift from the pines. May would pause in the middle of tying a bundle of dried grass, her head turned slightly to listen. Talon, seated near the fire, would lift his gaze, catching hers in the golden lamplight. Neither spoke of it, but they seemed to understand that the sound belonged to the space they now shared. Each time May handed him a bowl of medicine, her eyes stayed on him a heartbeat longer, as if to be sure he would drink. Talon would take it, letting his fingers brush hers, not lingering on purpose but not pulling away either. In passing through the narrow room, their steps often slowed, long enough to feel the space close between them, long enough to hear the faint rustle of cloth brushing cloth. Outside, spring still could not settle. A morning might be clear as glass, only to turn to thick gray within the hour. Mountain winds sometimes carried the bright pitch of pine resin, other times the heavy scent of wet earth and leaf mold. May and Talon learned to foretell these changes for each other, not to avoid them, but to prepare. May would move drying herbs closer to the fire if rain was coming. Talon would split extra logs and stack them in the shed before the weather turned. The world beyond the wooden door still existed, with its laws and haunts, its prejudices. But inside this house, life was measured in small acts. A bowl of hot broth offered at just the right moment, a folded wool blanket placed within easy reach. A late afternoon when May laid herbs to dry on the porch, while Talon repaired the reins of the horse he had led back from the riverbank. Yet on the far side of the ridge, where thin smoke curled from Apache lodges, a rumor had begun to spread. They spoke of the life-saving kiss, an act which, under the old law, was a sacred bond, unbreakable. Such whispers wove through the fireside talk of young warriors, into the stories of old women plaiting baskets. And with every shift of wind, those words found their way toward places Talon had hoped they would never reach. He knew, sooner or later, the stillness here would be touched by it. But he didn't say so, May didn't ask. Between them, silence continued like a thread, fine yet strong, tying together two lives that didn't belong to the same world. One morning, while drawing water from the well, Talon saw May in the back garden, her hands deep in the soil around a row of new shoots. The sunlight slanted low, turning her hair the color of wet chestnut. He paused, just for a moment, to fix the sight in his mind, not as curiosity, but as the rare recognition of a peace he seldom found. In that small house, each day was a chain of repeated acts that never felt dull, because there was another person there to share them. Talk of wind, of the scent of leaves after rain, of the night owl's call were not mere words. They were the small stones laid across a narrowing space between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a valley filled with judgment. Outside, the rumor drifted still, like cooking smoke curling into the morning mist, seen by no one, but sensed by all. Inside, the silences stayed full, and both seemed to understand they were worth more than any explanation. The morning Talon left May's cabin. The hillside still held a haze of early mist. The sun had yet to crest the ridge, sending only pale gold ribbons into the valley below. May stood on the porch, one hand keeping her coat from the wind's lift, saying nothing, not asking when he would return. Between them was a silence they had grown used to, one that needed no farewell, yet carried all the meaning of one. Talon cinched the saddle tight, checked the reins, and swung up onto his horse. The trail toward his people wound through stone cuts and along the Black Elk, its waters settling back from the wild surge of the storm. On the way, the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth mixed into the cold of morning. He tried to keep his mind as still as the road ahead, but deep down he knew the news had traveled before him, faster than a horse's stride, faster than the river's flow. At the edge of tribal land, he saw the thin columns of smoke rising from the main camp. Children ran across the open ground, stopping to stare before slipping behind the shelter of grown figures. Warriors near the fire circles fell quiet, their eyes following every motion he made. No one spoke, yet the tension hung in the air like storm clouds gathering. The elder sat beside the great fire, a blanket drawn over his shoulders, his eyes dark and deep as mountain stone. When Talon approached, there was no invitation to sit, only a small nod, and a gaze that seemed to look through the dust on his clothes to the heart beneath. The elder's words were few, but they fell with the weight of a stone breaking the skin of still water. Under the old law, a life-saving kiss, the breath given to one standing at the edge, was a cord binding two souls, one that could not be cut. To honor that bond, Talon and May must become husband and wife. It was not a choice. It was a duty. Talon sat still, feeling the subtle movements of the crowd around him. From the smaller fires, murmurs rose, not all in agreement. Old Quito, who had once stood with Talon's father in battle, nodded his approval, saying law was the spine of the people. But across the circle, the eyes of Yana, Talon's cousin on his mother's side, had darkened. His voice was sure and cold. May was an outsider, and more than that, she carried the ill fortune spoken of in her own town. Talon knew Yana's words would find allies. In lean years, the tribe had closed its gates to strangers, had borne the cost of trusting the wrong ones. And now, a widow shadowed by death was as much a question mark as it was a woman. The council ended without resolution. The elder left his words hanging like smoke, neither pressing nor allowing anyone to think the law could be ignored. Talon left the fire circle with the shadows stretching long, the sun angling through the peaks and casting everything in a dull brass glow. That night in his lodge, Talon heard the low beat of a distant drum, slow, deliberate, a reminder to all that this was an unsettled matter. He sat beside the coals, turning over the small stones he used to mark the path of a hunt or the course of a river. Each stone that night carried a heavier meaning, one for the elder's decree, one for the voices of dissent, one for the silence of those he trusted but had not yet heard from. Outside, half the tribe had chosen their side. One half clung to the law as to a tent peg in a storm. The other stood with Yana, saying to open the way to an outsider, especially one with the shadow of death upon her, was a risk no people could afford. Talon knew the matter would not stay at the fire circle. The news would pass through hunters, mothers at the river, children at play, and would travel beyond the tribe. Like the wind, it would find its way over the mountains, down the river, and all the way to Dry Willow. In his mind, he saw May's cabin, the scent of wild mint drifting from the stove, the golden firelight over her face as she bent to grind roots. He thought of the way she placed a bowl in his hands, the small nod in place of questions. Law might bind two people together, but what he remembered of May was not a chain. It was something he had taken up willingly. Yet the division in his people was real, and it was about more than a woman. It touched a deeper fear, the fear of losing identity, of being erased by forces from beyond, of the day the fire circles might be extinguished not by storm or rain, but by the hands of men. As the fire in his lodge burned low, Talon understood that every step he took from here would press harder on the crack running through his people. And somewhere, in a cabin on the hillside, May was likely still grinding her medicine, not knowing her name was on more lips than she had ever met. In Dry Willow, news traveled faster than the wind. All it took was one person to hear something from the far side of the ridge, and by nightfall, the whole town had something to murmur over their beer or behind the narrow walls of their kitchens. And the story of May Caldwell's life-saving kiss to an Apache warrior wasn't just retold. It was honed into a dagger, passed from one hand to the next. No one spoke of the sudden storm, of her plunge into the roaring black elk, or of the breath that dragged a man back from the edge. They spoke only of the 3 deaths, 3 men who had walked through her door and never walked out again. The first husband's death in the mine collapse was now told as the first sign of her curse. The second, lost to winter fever, became a tale of cold neglect, embroidered with extra cruelty. And the third, ambushed on the road, was now tied to May's shadow, as if she herself had pulled the trigger. At Hank Duffy's saloon, over the clink of glasses and the uneven notes of a weary piano, a few men spoke low but loud enough for anyone passing to catch. They shook their heads, saying that if she could bring ruin to her own kind, what chance would an Apache have? The women, meeting at the well or in the general store, wasted no opportunity to season the story, sometimes with a passing glance, sometimes with a half-finished sentence. May had known this before, but this time, the story had leapt past her personal name and become a reason for a collective anger. In times when the line between Dry Willow and Apache land was held by fear and rifles, the thought of a woman in town marrying a warrior from across the ridge was like pouring oil on a fire that had always been smoldering. In the days after Talon's departure, May kept on with her work, tending the garden, drying herbs, keeping the house neat. But there was something in the wind that warned of trouble. Strange footsteps stopped outside her gate. Conversations fell silent when she entered the store. The looks that once slid past her now lingered longer, heavier. That afternoon, with the sun leaning toward the mountains, May returned from gathering wild mint on the back slope. She found a folded paper tucked under her door, the edge stained dark with dried mud. She bent to pick it up and recognized the handwriting. Sam Fletcher, an old friend from her days at the mail station before he'd gone chasing gold in Montana. Just a few lines. They're talking in groups, May. Not everyone, but enough to do harm. If that wedding happens, There'll be violence. Keep yourself safe. She read it again, folded it, and stood for a long moment by the table. Outside, the wind moved across the roof, carrying the smell of some far-off cooking fire. The hens had already gone to roost, their wing beats fading into stillness. The air inside thickened, not only with the dark closing in, but with the weight of those words on the small page. May had lived in Dry Willow long enough to know a warning like this wasn't bluster. In town, when fear was dressed up as honor and the defense of order, it could turn into violence fast. And once the armed men had been given a reason to step out into the night, few could stop them. She slid the note into the bottom drawer, the place where she kept things that didn't need seeing every day, but could not be thrown away. Then she stoked the fire, not for warmth, but so the smell of smoke and the crack of burning wood might drown out the silence in her head. Her hands kept busy cutting roots, but her mind traced the paths that news like this might take. Outside, the last light fell over the black elk, the river's skin reflecting the deep red streaks of sunset. The trail from town to her home lay still, but its quiet now felt like a stretched cloth, ready to tear with the smallest rip. May knew that from now until Talon returned, each day would weigh heavier, and each glance from Dry Willow would carry more than curiosity. Inside the small cabin, she worked as always, but every sound from the yard, every shadow passing the gate drew her notice. Not from panic, but because instinct told her this. The fiercest winds often begin with a breath of cold so thin you barely feel it. The message came to May in the early morning, when mist still clung to the mountain's flank, and damp clung thick to the timbers of the porch roof. A young man from Talon's people rode up, speaking little, handing her a small leather pouch of dried leaves and a message from the elder. In each word she heard a condition, a trial meant not only to measure skill, but to weigh the heart. The elder's youngest daughter had been burning with fever for a week. The old women had burned herbs to smoke the sickness away, brewed roots into bitter teas, prayed under the moonlight, yet the heat still flared red across the child's brow. The elder had said, if May could cure her, she would be accepted into the fire circle, a place outsiders almost never set foot. May packed what she needed into a cloth bag, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped into the yard. The sky had yet to fully open. Its pale light filtered through a thick curtain, slowing the world to a hush. Her small horse shook its mane, breath curling into the cold morning like white smoke. The ride to Talon's camp felt longer than she remembered. Or perhaps the weight of each step made the miles heavier, each one carrying her deeper into ground where she had never been welcome. When she arrived, eyes turned from the low lodges to follow her every move. No one spoke, but the silence was thick, as though each gaze measured her against stories already told. The elder's lodge stood on the eastern edge of camp, where the day's first light touched when it crossed the ridge. Outside, a few older women sat in a circle, fingers working strips of braided leather, eyes flicking toward her and away. Inside, the air was steeped in the sharp, heavy scent of herbs, burned too many days in a row, mixed with the damp heat of a sick room. The child lay on a hide blanket, cheeks flushed deep, lips cracked, breath fast and weighty. Her eyes stayed shut, trembling faintly with each cough, as though her small body was fighting something unseen. May sat beside her, placing one hand lightly on her brow, then moving to rest it over her chest to feel the heartbeat. This was no common fever. The metallic, astringent tang in the child's sweat told her as much. Years of treating odd sicknesses in town guided her to the truth. This was poisoning, and the source was almost certainly water. The thirst and dryness were too strong to ignore. Quietly, she asked one of the women nearby and learned that the camp had recently bought water from a passing trader, as their stream had been choked with mud after heavy rains. May remembered that not long ago, in Dry Willow, a family had been struck with violent illness and high fever after drinking water from that same trader. The barrels had been salvaged from an old mine, their metal lining eaten through, leaching poison into the water. She told them to fetch fresh water from a small mountain spring she knew to be clean. While they went, May opened her bag and mixed dried wormwood, dandelion root, and a fine powder of crushed charcoal. Stirred into warm water, it would bind the poison and draw it out. She gave it to the child in slow spoonfuls, knowing a frail body couldn't take too sharp a jolt. Outside, clouds thinned and sunlight fell in thin strips across the lodge roof. Inside, May worked with patient steadiness, replacing cool cloths on the child's forehead, listening to each shift in her breathing. The sound of Talon's boots approached outside, pausing before he stepped in. His eyes met hers. No words. But there was worry there, and a cautious ember of hope. By the time the sun was high, the small tremors in the child's limbs had eased. Sweat beaded on her temples, and her breathing slowed, lost some of its weight. May gave her more of the new water, adding a little honey to soothe her throat. When the girl's eyes opened for the first time in days, a ripple of breath passed through everyone present. The elder stepped inside, tall, slow in his movements, his eyes black and deep as a spring in flood season. He looked at his daughter, then at May. There was no smile, no praise, only a single nod, but in that nod was the weight of recognition. Talon walked May out. As evening fell, the air changed. Eyes still followed her, but with less steel in them. In one corner of the yard a few children played, and as she passed, a little girl smiled, clear as the last light of day. May knew the trial was not over. In Dry Willow, this news would twist into different shapes. Maybe the tale of a woman who saved the elder's daughter. Maybe just another piece of kindling for old grudges. But here, in this moment, she had laid the first stone on a bridge neither side had yet named. The sky gave its warning before the hail arrived. A strange, heavy silence. The familiar sounds, the creek's murmur through the cut, the wind threading through the pines, were gone, leaving a hollow stillness in their place. Talon reined in his horse, tilting his head back, and May saw his eyes narrow beneath the brim of his buckskin hat. To the west, clouds had massed into slabs of violet gray, dense as fresh ground ink, and the air carried the metallic scent of a storm. They had left camp before daylight, following a narrow trail known only to those born to the land. It led to a hidden valley beyond the mountains where, Talon said, grew a rare medicinal plant that flowered for only a few weeks each year. Its root could heal wounds that refused to close and ease pain through the hard winters. The elder wanted to gather it before the cold came down. The first pellet of hail struck the brim of May's hat with a dry, sharp crack. Then came dozens, then hundreds. White ice hammering earth, saddle leather, and thick coats. Talon urged his horse into a tight cut between two rock faces where a natural overhang gave some shelter. They dismounted, leading the horses close to the wall. Talon pulled his heavy cloak from his shoulders and wrapped it around May, holding the edges against the wind with both hands. He said nothing, only dipped his head to watch the gusts whip at her face, as though measuring how much she could bear. May didn't object. The cloak felt like a warm cocoon, and his breath near her ear smelled faintly of pine smoke. The hail drummed on the ground like 100 small drums, furious at first, then faltering. May looked out to see the trail they'd just ridden now gone white, hoofprints already buried beneath a crust of ice. Far off, thunder rolled like a drumbeat from inside the earth, deepening the shadow in their cramped shelter. From his saddlebag, Talon took a small knife and lengths of tough cord, methodically securing the packs and tack. Then he settled beside her. In the flickering half-light, his eyes no longer held the constant watchfulness she'd come to know, but a patient stillness, as though he'd long ago learned how to wait a storm out. May realized she was learning too, not by fidgeting, but by listening for the pauses between the wind's lashes. When the hail softened, they mounted again. Ice shards shattered under the horses' hooves, skittering off the trail like splintered glass. The descent into the valley was slick, but Talon led the way, keeping May's mount behind his own, shielding her from sudden drops. More than once he reached back to take her reins when the wind shoved her horse toward the edge. They arrived under only a light misting rain. The valley opened like a great cupped hand, walled by sheer cliffs, the floor carpeted in green with clusters of small, deep purple flowers, the plant they had come for. May knelt by one, breathing in its sharp, unmistakable scent. She dug, carefully for the root, wrapping it in broad leaves to keep it moist. Talon worked nearby, his cuts quick but unhurried, each one clean and deliberate. By the time their 2 leather sacks were nearly full, enough for the winter, the clouds had broken, showing pale scraps of sky. On the ride back, May noticed how bits of hail still clung to the pine boughs, catching the sun like tiny beads of glass. She thought, unbidden, of that moment in the rock hollow, of the heat trapped under his cloak, of his hand holding it shut against the wind, and how the cold outside had all but vanished. Neither of them spoke of it. But near the camp's edge, Talon turned his head, looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod, a simple gesture. But enough for May to know this journey had brought back more than medicine. It had returned with something else, nameless for now, but already rooted deep. The little girl lay on a coarse wool blanket, her face flushed with fever, lips cracked and dry. Firelight spilled across her thin cheeks, deepening the shadows under her eyes. May set down the pouch of fresh dug roots beside her, opening it so the sharp, earthy scent filled the lodge, mingling with wood smoke and the damp heat of the sick room. Talon sat in the corner, one broad hand supporting the child's neck to keep her head tilted. His eyes stayed fixed on May as she began grinding the roots into powder, mixing them with warm water, and adding a few drops of wild mint oil to quiet the nausea. She spoke no words, but every movement was deliberate, certain, as though she had already traced each step in her mind. When the first spoonful touched the girl's lips, the elder and the others watching fell utterly still. After a moment, she gave a small cough, then swallowed. The fever didn't break right away, but her breathing began to settle into a steadier rhythm. May kept at it, alternating small sips of medicine with cool cloths on her brow. Outside, darkness drew down, the steady drumbeat of the night watch carrying from a distance, braided with the wind in the trees. By midnight, sweat began to bead on the girl's forehead. May knew it was a good sign. She wiped her clean, changed the cloth, and stayed by her side until the heat truly began to fade. At first light, the child opened her eyes. They were still clouded, but now held recognition. A low sigh of relief rippled through the lodge. The elder laid a hand on May's shoulder. He said nothing, but the weight of his palm was as solid as a spoken vow. But May didn't leave just yet. She turned to Talon, gave a small nod. It was time. They walked out together, straight to the largest wooden house in Dry Willow, the mayor's residence. The air still held the morning mist, but a small crowd had already gathered. Word of the elder's daughter's recovery had spread fast, and like all news in the West, it came tangled with other whispers about poisoned water, about a strange trader hauling heavy casks from somewhere back east. Talon knocked 3 times, hard. When the mayor opened the door, his eyes flickered, then masked themselves behind a polite smile. May didn't give him time to speak. She drew from her bag a small ceramic jar filled with water, taken from one of those barrels sold to the tribe. "Do you know what's in this?" Her voice was even, but carried so every ear in the street could hear. Talon set in the mayor's hand a small scrap of metal, turned green-gray with corrosion, a mark of the toxins that leached into the water. A murmur rose from the crowd. A man stepped forward from the back, saying he'd been hired to haul those casks from the mayor's own storage. When May asked, he admitted he'd seen metallic powder mixed in, meant, as he'd been told, to weaken the strength of those who drank it. Cornered, the mayor's tone shifted, blaming the Kyasusun, out-of-town trader. But Talon pulled from his saddlebag a leather pouch containing a signed contract, his contract, with the mayor's name inked clear, spelling out delivery terms and payment. The anger moved fast. It wasn't just the Apache now. Townsfolk who had always eyed May with suspicion began voicing their own grievances, about water prices doubling, about crops ruined from tainted irrigation, about cattle dying in their pens. One story led to another, as though the truth had been waiting too long to be spoken. The mayor was forced to turn over every barrel and the entire reserve to be managed by the community. The town council would meet to try him, but everyone knew his power was gone. By the time Talon and May returned to the camp, the elder's daughter was fully awake, sitting by the fire, color back in her cheeks. The elder rose, his gaze sweeping the people before fixing on May. "This woman," he said, "is from this day a part of us. Her blood and breath have saved a child of the tribe." Agreement rang out in the circle. For the first time since coming to these lands, May felt she was no longer only a guest at someone else's fire. That night, sitting outside with the flames high in the stone ring, Talon handed her a cup of warm water. He didn't thank her, didn't speak of what had passed. But his eyes held hers long and deep, as if seeing every shadow, every scar within her, and accepting them all. May knew there would still be trials ahead, but under the wide western night, stars sharp as cold steel above them, she knew one thing for certain. From here on, she would not face them alone. That morning, no one sent for them. Yet the whole town of Dry Willow gathered in the square. The sky was clear, slow white clouds drifting across a pale blue, but the air was thick, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something unlike any meeting before. The former mayor stood at the edge, stripped of his swagger, just another shadow among the crowd, avoiding every pair of eyes. In the open center, Talon and May stepped forward. He wore no ceremonial dress of his people, no fur cloak, just a plain earth-colored shirt. dark leather trousers, and a simple belt. May stood beside him, not in a white dress, not wearing silver, but in a weathered pale blue gown, her hair tied back neatly. Her hands rested calmly at her side, not reaching for his, not folding in on herself. They stood side by side like two trees that had braced through many seasons of wind, needing no touch to know they leaned in the same direction. Talon's gaze swept the crowd. Among them were faces that had once doubted May, that had turned away when she passed. Now they waited, silent, for his words. "You know," his voice was deep and steady, carrying without a shout. "Our old law says that a life-saving kiss is a bond that cannot be broken. But I'll tell you this here, before all—" He paused, letting the air settle. "I choose May not because of that law. I choose her because before I could prove my worth to anyone, she had already seen it." A ripple moved through the gathering. Some lowered their heads, others looked away. She saved a child's life without asking for anything. She risked herself to find medicine, stood before power to speak the truth, and she did it not for my honor, but because it was the right thing to do too. He let the wind carry through the pause, taking the murmurs with it. "I do not need a law to bind us. I need choice, and I have it. If anyone would oppose, speak now." Silence followed. Not tense, more like a space left for each to reckon with themselves. Then a woman's voice rose from the back. It was the mother of the child May had saved. "No one has the right to stand against the one who saved my daughter's life." Agreement followed, not in cheers, but in firm, steady voices, each yes building into a low wave. May said nothing. She only inclined her head, as if the answer had already been given the night by the fire. When Talon had handed her a cup of warm water, and they had sat in silence, both knowing they had found their place beside each other. Yet within the acceptance, May still caught other looks, gazes that had not let go of suspicion, or could not easily forgive an outsider stepping into what had long been closed. She understood. True change never came from a single morning or a single speech. When the meeting broke, people drifted away, though many lingered near the square. Some spoke to May in low tones, offering short nods, and even an invitation or two to share a meal. Not all, but enough to crack the wall that had stood between her and the town. Talon brought the horses around, taking her hand to help her mount. But instead of riding off, he turned his horse back to face the square. "Those who want to rebuild the water supply, meet us at the old warehouse this afternoon," he said. "We'll do it together, tribe and town." May felt it meant more than any wedding or ceremony, because this was an invitation to work side by side, not to force acceptance through a vow. By afternoon, when they returned to the warehouse, nearly 20 people waited, Apache and townsfolk alike, some who had once stood on opposite sides. They began to plan how to clean the water source, test the wells, block the streams of contamination. May listened, adding her thoughts when needed, and saw it plain. When people bent to the same task, differences seemed smaller. Night fell as Talon and May rode back. Crossing the grass hill, he stopped, letting the night wind carry the scent of wild mint and damp earth. "Tomorrow will be harder than today," he said quietly, "but you won't have to do it alone." May looked toward the horizon, where the fires of the town and the tribe burned against the dark, separate, yet sharing the same glow. And she knew some changes don't begin by winning over a crowd. They begin with a simple statement, spoken before all: "I choose her." That evening, The banks of the Black Elk River seemed quieter than usual. The water moved slow, mirroring the pale gold sky of late season, where the sun was in no hurry to sink, and the breeze was only strong enough to stir small ripples. This was the place where it had all begun, where May had bent down, her breath meeting Talon's, and an old law had been stirred awake by accident. Now they returned, not to revisit that day, but to rewrite it with a new ceremony. There were no straight rows of chairs like the church in town. Instead, a wide circle was formed from hides spread across the grass, rough wooden benches, and a few woven blankets laid out for the elders. In the center was an open space just wide enough for the late sunlight to slip through, laying a soft, honey hue over May's hair. In her hand she carried a white lace scarf, thin as mist and yellowed with age, the only thing she had left from her mother. She wrapped it around her wrist, feeling as though she carried a piece of family with her, even if none of them were here. Talon approached from the far side of the circle. He wore a dark deerskin shirt stitched with Apache designs across the shoulders, though it carried no heavy air of ceremony. In his hand was a small bundle of wildflowers, just a few sprigs of lavender, silver-green mint, and a stem of sage, something he said would hold the scent of this season until winter came. When he handed the flowers to May, the fiddle began to play. It wasn't solemn processional music, but a plain, slow melody, carrying the pace of land and wind. The player was Amos, an old friend of Talon's from his roaming days. He sat on a drifted log, smiling faintly under the brim of his wide hat, his fingers moving over the strings like telling a story only he knew. The ceremony began with the blessing of the Apache elder. He read from no paper, and his voice carried none of the flatness of distant ritual. He spoke in the language of his people, each short phrase like an arrow, pausing so the wind could carry it before he spoke again. May did not understand all the words, but she felt their weight. They seemed carved from stone, steady and unyielding. When the elder laid his hands on their shoulders, May suddenly saw both the townsfolk and the tribe standing within the same circle. Some faces had once been cold to her, some still weren't ready to open fully, but at least they were here. There were those from far away, standing side by side, not because they agreed on everything, but because they wanted to witness something that would not come again easily. There were no loud vows, only the look they gave each other, as if the words they needed had been gathered over the past months, from the night May crossed the forest for medicine, to the day Talon stood before the crowd and said he chose her not because of the law. The elder tied a strip of red cloth around their joined hands, tight enough to feel a shared pulse, loose enough to slip free. "No cord can hold two people," he said slowly in English, "if they do not wish to stay together." The fiddle played again, this time a little faster, like the beat of a heart stepping into the unknown. Everyone joined in, no line between guest and host. Some Apache danced in a circle, bare feet striking the grass in rhythm. A town girl lifted her skirts to dodge the mud, laughing and clapping. Children ran between them, waving ribbons cut from May's old wedding dress, tossing them into the air. May felt herself surrounded not by a community that had fully accepted her, but by a gathering of people willing, for now, to stand together. And that was enough. As the sun sank, the last light poured over the riverbank in a burnished copper glow. Talon led May to the water's edge, where the rounded stones shone wet. He crouched, dipped his hand in the river, and let the drops run over the lace on her wrist. "So Black Elk will remember this day," he said softly. May didn't answer, just tightened her fingers around his, feeling the warmth through the damp cloth. She thought of the path that had brought her here, from the wary glances in Dry Willow, the rumors, to the night of hail by the mountain stream. And now, under this open sky, she knew she no longer stood at the edge of someone else's story. The fiddle still played as they left the riverbank, blending with the sound of footsteps, low voices, and the water lapping the shore. That night, the Black Elk kept a secret. Its current had carried this wedding away, so that one day, if anyone asked, the river could answer with the scent of wild mint and the music still riding the wind. Wind rose from the valley, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and the damp trace of the Black Elk River still lingering from the afternoon. The house on the mountainside cast a soft golden glow from its windows, not bright, but warm, enough to be seen from a distance and to tell anyone looking that someone was there, waiting. Talon tied his horse in the corral with unhurried hands, as if he wasn't eager to let this day end. Every loosened rein, every button slipped free from his coat was its own quiet ritual, a way to shift from belonging to the crowd back to belonging to this home. May stood on the porch, both hands wrapped around a cup of wild mint tea Talon had gathered along the trail home. Steam curled upward, mingling with the scent of dried leaves and wood smoke. Her fingers brushed the silver bracelet etched with a hawk, Talon's gift, placed in her hand the moment the wedding crowd had gone. No explanation, but in the careful lines of the carving, she could see wings spread wide over a canyon. It was not a promise of an easy life. They both knew winter here could lock folks in snow for weeks, and the fragile peace between the town and his people was still as thin as the ice on an early spring creek. But the way Talon had given her the bracelet was no accident. It was his way of saying, "When the wind shifts, I'll still be here." Inside, the fire still held its red coals from the morning. May set the cup on the table and took her place on the bench by the window. Talon stepped in and laid a small sack on the table. Wild potatoes, a few dried mushrooms, and a bit of cloth wrapped around spare tinder. No one spoke of dividing the work. Things simply found their place, like two pieces of land with different soil meeting under the same rain. Supper was simple. Potatoes roasted in the coals, smoked venison, and cornbread May had baked the day before. They ate slowly, letting each bite be its own pause. And in those pauses, children's laughter drifted up from the Apache camp below, blending with the fading rhythm of hoofbeats heading down the valley road. After the meal, Talon cleared the plates. May fed the fire, coaxing it to pop and flare, casting light over the darkened beams overhead. Their shadows stretched across the wall, not perfectly aligned, but moving in the same direction, like two people who had chosen the same road without anyone forcing their steps. Outside, night had settled. The lights from the camp below glittered like a string of fallen stars, trembling when the wind passed. May pulled on her cloak and stepped out to lean against a porch post. Talon followed, silent, setting his hand on the rail close enough that his warmth reached her. The silver bracelet was cool against May's wrist in the night air, but she didn't take it off. Her fingers traced the hawk, and she thought about tomorrow, the week ahead, and the winter creeping near. There would be days when the water in the jar froze solid, when the road to the valley disappeared under snow. There would be new rumors, new looks from people slow to forget. But there would also be mornings when the smell of coffee filled the house, evenings when Talon returned from the woods with a handful of mint, and nights when they sat by the fire, knowing each other's thoughts without a word spoken. The sky above spread wide, heavy with stars, each one sharp enough to feel within reach. A shooting star cut across the dark, quick as a breath held by someone guarding a wish. May didn't speak the thought in her heart, and Talon didn't ask. Some promises, when named, lose their weight. They are meant to be kept quietly, shown in small acts, a cloak draped over shoulders when the rain comes, a bowl of medicine placed in someone's hands without waiting for thanks. An owl called from the tree line, low and slow, as if to mark this night for those who knew how to listen. May turned to Talon and found his gaze on her, not searching, not questioning, only making sure she was here, truly here. They stayed that way until the chill pushed them back inside. The door closed, shutting out the wind but keeping the scent of smoke and mint. The fire still glowed on the hearth, and on the table the silver bracelet caught the light, as if holding a piece of the flame for itself. The night passed slow. No hoofbeats, no footsteps. Only two people in a small house where a promise unspoken could be clearer than any vow. The sky over the Black Elk wasn't exactly clear that night, but it was wide enough to hold the start of something new. May and Talon stood together, without grand oaths or pretty words, only a look that said from here on they would walk the same wind-scoured road. In the West, love doesn't come from what's promised. It comes from the moments you hold fast through the storm. If you love stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next Wild West love story. What do you think of the life-saving kiss that bound May to an unexpected marriage? If it were you, would you stay or would you walk away?